Head of Programming and Outreach for the Georgetown County Library System, and welcome to DigiBridge 2.0, a series of 12 humanities lectures by local experts on various elements of Georgetown County's deep, diverse history and culture. All presentations are free and open to the public. During March, we began the series at our new Southern Georgetown Library on Powell Road. In April, we hosted 4 more exciting presentations at our Carvers Bay Library in Hemingway. And now in April, we're rounding out DigiBridge 2.0 here at our welcoming Andrews Library on North Morgan Avenue in Andrews, South Carolina. And we want to say thank you especially to Rose Lewis, our branch manager here out at the Andrews Library, for being such a gracious host. In addition, all 12 presentations will also be made available for viewing afterwards on the Georgetown County Library YouTube page. So please check them out there, view them or review them up on the Georgetown County Library YouTube page. DigiBridge 2.0 is supported with a growth grant from South Carolina Humanities with funding provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities. South Carolina Humanities is a not-for-profit organization inspiring, engaging, and enriching South Carolinians with programs on literature, history, culture, and heritage. And today, we have a great treat. We end our DigiBridge 2.0 series with a truly grand finale with a personality who needs no introduction, although we'll give her one anyway. This is a wonderful signature person and figure all around Georgetown County. The ins and outs of Georgetown County history are known to this one, Lee Brockington. Lee Brockington can tell you a lot about a lot of things in terms of Georgetown County. So she seems to know everything about everything around here. She is a proud graduate of Columbia College. She is a historian and author whose books include Plantation Between the Waters, A Brief History of Hobcaw Barony from the History Press in 2006, and Polly's Island with Steve Roberts from Arcadia in 2018. Lee Brockington recently retired as Senior Interpreter of History for the Belle W. Baruch Foundation at Hobcaw Barony, though she remains every bit as visible as a community voice. For instance, this will mark her second major public history talk in the space of about a week. She just gave a great talk at the Georgetown Library in downtown Georgetown on Cleveland Street there for our Tuesdays With series last week on the Grimke sisters. So she's back again within 8 days, an 8-day span to give another great presentation. Here today at Andrews Library. So Lee Brockington is not slowing down. In fact, she might be speeding up. She does freelance work as well, does history out on the waterways and leads tours there. And she's here today to talk about those waterways. Her topic today, the 5 rivers of Georgetown County, how the environment influences the culture. So wonderful, fascinating, deep topic, as deep as those rivers. So please welcome a local and more than local treasure, Lee Brockington.
Thank you so much. It is always my great pleasure to come to any library, but particularly in Georgetown County, to be at our Andrews Library, where so many fond memories exist from storytelling sessions when all the children were young. It's a good place to come back to. There is an old proverb that says, no matter how far the river flows, it never forgets its source. Georgetown County is dominated by the 5 rivers that have shaped, influenced, and nearly destroyed her people. We'll take a look at those 5 rivers: the Waccamaw, the Great PD, the Black River, the Sandpit River, and the Santee. All of these rivers flow through our low country and all the way to the sea. And what a wonderful watershed it creates. Scientifically, Waccamaw Bay is the 3rd largest watershed on the East Coast, receiving water from upstream. Upstream indeed. The Waccamaw begins at Lake Waccamaw in Whiteville, North Carolina, not too far from Fayetteville, North Carolina. And that river, Waccamaw, receives water from so much of eastern North Carolina. The Great PD is so much like the mighty Mississippi. Let me take you on a trip. The Great PD River's headwaters, that drip, drip, drip at almost any river's headwaters, begins in North Carolina, but way up at Grandfather Mountain, at Blowing Rock, North Carolina. And in North Carolina, the river is named the Yadkin. And the Yadkin River receives water from above it in southwest Virginia. Hundreds of acres run toward what North Carolina calls the Yadkin and what we in South Carolina begin to call the PD, just as it enters the state. And as that river snakes its way all the way across the state of North Carolina, it enters South Carolina and flows down to us at Waccamaw Bay. The Black River, about 150 miles long, beginning up around Bishopville, South Carolina, flowing through Sumter County, Clarendon County, Williamsburg, and Georgetown counties. And the Black River is one of the oldest rivers east of the Mississippi. The Sandra River is one of the shortest rivers east of the Mississippi, traveling only 10 miles from west of the city, not far from 9 Mile Curve between Georgetown and Andrews. Sandpit River Bridge and the Sandpit community, as we look out there at the trickle heading its way toward town, I think about some riverine ecologists who argue that it's really just a creek, that it doesn't meet all the strict definitions of a river. But we've called it Sandpit River for over 300 years, and we're not stopping now. And the Santee, once the most powerful river east of the Mississippi. But what's your definition of powerful? The answer, according to those riverine ecologists, is volume in this case. In this case, the Santee, that downhill portion of a huge system. Upstate, the Saluda and the Broad come together, carry water to create the Congaree in Columbia. And then the Congaree and the Wateree combine to form the Santee. And the Santee carries all that water and all that sediment, and boom, when it hits the ocean on Georgetown County's southern boundary, it drops its load of sediment and forms a delta. The Santee Delta, the only true river delta on the East Coast. And the Waccamaw, a rare, nearly north-south river that since 1935 has also been a part of the intra-coastal waterway and thus a superhighway. In the 1940s, easily through the 2000s, a superhighway for the military and for a great deal of commercial traffic that has been traveling inland, not on the ocean, but instead parallel to the ocean. The Waccamaw, for so long, the inland connection between north and south, even east and west transportation, also rice cultivation in the 18th and 19th centuries. All 5 rivers would simply become known as the rice rivers of Georgetown before the American Civil War. Today, we'll hear first about how the geography and the early history of Native Americans, of trading posts, the royal influence and the founding of the port of Georgetown, the rice era, and in the early 20th century, duck hunters from off who helped save 66 miles of contiguous shoreline, and then transportation changes from rivers to highways, from ferries to bridges, from industry to golf, and now on many properties, county, state, and federal protection, in addition to private owners, putting their riverfront property in protection so that it is protected in perpetuity. And as we begin our journey, listen to the names: Winyah, Waccamaw, PD, Sampit, Santee, and know that even the Black River was originally called the Weenie. And what do these names have in common? Native Americans. Native Americans of the Eastern Siouan group dominated our area, but were divided, not into one large tribe, but into several different tribes, like our own communities of Georgetown County, located at geographic centers, whether it is on the water or on the railroad tracks, like here in Andrews. The Winyah tribe took its name from the body of water, Winyah, which means the bend. Think about bending your arms out, arms akimbo. Winyah, the bend, people of the bend, as the Winyah tribe became known. And why was Winyah named this, that body of water? Because Winyah Bay curves around Hobcaw to empty into the Atlantic Ocean. It travels south of Georgetown, curves around the southern tip of the Waccamaw Neck at Hobcaw. Hobcaw, Native American word that means between the waters, or as I often told third graders, think of Hobcaw as an Indian word for peninsula. Well, one time, about 3 hours after introducing the definition peninsula to this group, right before they got on the bus, I said, "Who remembers what the word Winyah means?" And they all said, "The bend." I said, "Who remembers what Waccamaw means?" And they said, "Coming and going." And then I said, "Who remembers what Hobcaw means?" And one little girl, without a doubt in her mind, she raised her hand. I called on her and she said, "Chinchilla." And I thought to myself, we have not mentioned that animal in 3 hours. We don't even have that animal in Georgetown County. And I said, as we should say to all young children, "Tell us what you mean." And she said, "Bordered by water on 3 sides, like a Native American word for chinchilla, Hobcaw." So I gave her a full point, because after all, it was my pronunciation of peninsula that threw her off. From now on, I say peninsula, so I'm better understood. Think also of the Waccamaw River, named first by the Indians who became the Waccamaw Indians. This 150-mile-long freshwater river was named Coming and Going because of the tide, and named by the group who would be known as the Waccamaw tribe. The PD Indians, all along the strong river, noted its name, PD, meaning wading or shallow. And the PD is a shallow river compared to others, but still long and important to trade. It was the highway between Georgetown and all the way upriver to Cheraw, South Carolina, above Florence and almost to the state line. I was curious what Cheraw meant, so I had to look that up in Dr. and Mrs. Knifer's book, University of South Carolina professor, and Cheraw simply means fire town. A little more research to understand how the Native Americans came up with Firetown, but I know their football team is on fire every fall in Cheraw. The Weenie Indians lived and hunted along the river that we call the Black, due to its very dark, clear, cold water. Colored by the tannin and the needles of cypress and nearby pine trees, the Black River's curves and bends produced many bluffs as the river turned, and around the curves dropped sediment that over time created bluffs and created low areas. Imagine the gently undulating topography of the low country. And just as you assume that we are flat in the low country, you'll find sand hills as you drive from one area of the county to another. As you drive to Columbia via Andrews, to Manning, to Wedgefield, you pop out on 378, make a left turn, head west to Columbia, and you say to yourself, oh, it looks like I'm in the mountains, because all of a sudden you are before the sand hills of South Carolina, which look like mountains compared to what we've seen in the Low Country. The sand hills of South Carolina, 55 million years ago, oceanfront sand dunes. Yes, a half of South Carolina was literally underwater. Half of the state from Aiken to Columbia to Camden and on up into North Carolina's Pinehurst and Southern Pines. These sand hills exist between that line and all the way back to the ocean. All the way back, these sand ridges, rolling hills, and bluffs above the river. The Weenie Bluff on the Black River will become important to local and colonial trade earlier than activity on any other river. The Sandpit tribe named the river first, but we're not sure of the word's origin. I meet a few children who say sand pit, and we know that's not the origin of the word. Instead, it is a Native American word, Sam Pit. Sometimes for newcomers, I say like Uncle Sam. And the Santee tribe took its name from the river they named Gentle. Santee, Gentle. It's an ironic name, isn't it? Considering what we just said about the most powerful river east of the Mississippi. But remember, not only is it carrying such a great volume of water, but it has a great width and a great width of wetlands nearer the coast, meaning that the river widens and the river flows above its banks and into the river's floodplain. Bluffs along those rivers provided campsites and villages to Native Americans, then plantations, and in some cases communities and towns. Native Americans lived inland on high ground in Georgetown County. They traveled extensively to hunt bear, deer, turkey, fowl of all sorts, turtles, raccoons, possums, fish, clams, oysters. Their needs were met. Your two basic needs as a human, food and shelter. There was abundant resources for not only food, but also shelter. Native Americans found all the home building materials they needed, never teepees, and that's in this area, like in the Great Plains of America. Instead, our South Carolina Low Country offered up wood for what you and I might think of as cabins, shelters, wood-framed shelters, insulated with mud and clay. A fine example at the Horry County Museum upstairs in their exhibits, a recreation of a full-size Native American home for a family. I love thinking about that mud and that clay, and all I can remember is the time I got stuck in the youth van from church, got stuck in the gumbo, wearing a dress, wearing little cute pumps. We were taking a shortcut, which is always a bad sign. I wanted to take the youth through Blaine Black Mingo Church to show them the old cemetery where some of my Brockington ancestors are buried. Well, I didn't think about encountering gumbo. And when I slowed down, as I never should have done, I got stuck. One van following behind me, we put all the youth in that van, and we went on to Indiantown Presbyterian for the large youth rally. I stayed behind. I walked to a payphone. I talked to the staff at Mingo Esso and got picked up, carried back to the van, and he unglued me from the gumbo. I learned that day exactly what gumbo is, and I have never forgotten it. I would imagine it to be excellent insulation for anybody making a shelter. In the 15th century, the 1400s, we find more archaeological evidence of villages, of village sites further east, now on the Waccamaw Neck, near the Sandpit, even along Winyah Bay. So that tells us that the Native Americans, by the 1400s, are less transient, more sedentary, more agricultural. Archaeologists, and even you, have found arrowheads, spear points, knife points, all called projectile points, arrows, spears, and knives, but especially consider pottery. Pottery, some much earlier than 1400s, and some even as late as 1700s. These bluffs along the river provided high ground for Native Americans, but also it provided them a vantage point, a bluff where they could see other tribes approaching as they warred with one another, and also they could see colonists coming to offer trade, and then years later, colonists coming to take their land. Native American tribes were very competitive among each other, and wars among themselves led in part to the Native American tribes' decline. But Native American numbers declined the most, not due to wars, but instead due to enslavement. Shortly after the Carolina colony was established in 1670 at Charlestown, further inland from where it is now, up that Ashley River, not at the unprotected tip of the peninsula that we call Charleston. But the Carolina colony, by 1711, colonists were at war with Native Americans. In defeat, prisoners of war were sold into slavery. More Indian slaves were exported out of the Carolina colony than any other English mainland colony in America. And where were those Native American enslaved laborers sent? To the West Indies, to sugar plantations, already at work. Most of the Native Americans died in captivity. And more than war, more than disease, it was this early slave trade that decimated the Indians. Decimated. As I spoke to library staff several years ago and had an opportunity to first meet who is now our Andrews director, our branch manager, I remember reading about decimated, and someone very wise on the staff at the break said, "Lee, you know the real definition of decimated?" And I said, "Well, I do now." Because when I first wrote a column for the newspaper and wrote that the Waccamaw tribe of Indians had been decimated, in my mind, as I said it and what was interpreted by the reader, it sounded like all Native Americans, all the Waccamaw tribal members had been decimated, wiped out, right? Well, after that column was printed by the Sun News, my phone rang. And the telephone, I answered, "Hello, this is Lee." And someone on the other end said, "Hello, is this Lee Brockington? You write a column for the newspaper?" "Yes, that's me. Hello." "Well, my name is Chief Buster Hatcher. I'm a member of the Waccamaw tribe, and I just called to tell you I'm not dead." And I know from library audiences as well as my personal experience, it was an advantage to me to meet a living, breathing Waccamaw Indian, and then exactly to understand the word from our library staff member, Dennis, I believe, who was the one who said to me, "You know decimated doesn't mean wiped out." And I said, "Well, I know that now from Chief Buster Hatcher that my information was wrong." He said, "No, the word was right. Decimated. 1 in 10 survived. 9 out of 10 were killed." And what a blessing that day that somebody in my class made me stop and think about the definition of a word, because words matter. By 1711, also much land was being speculated and purchased. We know that by 1750, there were no Native American tribes living, working, or trading in the area that we call Georgetown County. Colonists were being greedy. A valuable Indian trade had been important to the early colonial efforts, and at the Indian trading post established on the PD River at Johanna Bluff, deer skins and bear skins were valuable articles. As many as 600 deer skins at one time were traded to the English as a substitute for their own English cattle leather. Cattle were growing scarce in England because of overcrowding, because of development in parts of England, and leather was a very valuable resource from the colony. Recent archaeology at Johanna Bluff has been showcased at the Education Center exhibits, at the Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge, just due north of Georgetown on Highway 701 at the PD River Bridge. Animal skins, but also salt, dugout canoes, corn. But colonists saw land more valuable than any of these other commodities. As colonists saw these bluffs along the river, they knew that this would be valuable land in the low country. If sea level at Huntington Beach State Park and at Pawleys Island is 0, imagine if you went from 0 to 70 feet above sea level on parts of the Black River, the PD River, and the Waccamaw River. What if you went to the county's highest point, an ancient sand dune in the middle of the Waccamaw River on Sandy Island, 76 feet above sea level, arguably the highest point in the county? Well, we know in South Carolina there are a lot higher places. The highest point in our state is Sassafras Mountain in the South Carolina mountains, and is 3,500 feet above sea level. So we're going from 0 to 76, then we're going to 3,500. But you also need to know that Mount Mitchell in North Carolina, not too far from us, is 6,700 feet above sea level. And the reason I mention that is because I want every Carolinian, North or South Carolinian, to know that Mount Mitchell, North Carolina, is the highest place on the entire east coast of North America. Some of you will argue that it's Mount Washington in New Hampshire, but Mount Mitchell is higher. Mount Washington is only 6,288, whereas Mount Mitchell is 6,700. With all these highs and lows, you know our rivers would be valuable real estate and worth fighting for. Indian wars, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and even then, at the turn of the 20th century, the return of the Yankees. Oh, the return of the Yankees. As we move through the 18th and 19th century history of our rivers and imagine proprietary grants, Winyah Barony, down near Esterville Plantation, Hobcaw Barony, directly across from the port of Georgetown, across Winyah Bay. Proprietary grants, then consider King's grants, which were early real estate agents like the Pauley family and the Alstons, the Perrys, and the Scriven families. Royal grants, which could be applied for by individuals and received by almost any person seeking to own land in this new colony, or at least an average person with money. And as land speculators bought and sold land, especially these bluffs, landowners began to make money immediately with the harvesting of timber. The early settlement of Georgetown moved from way up on the Weenie Bluff on the Black River down to the mouth of the Black River, at the mouth of the PD, at the mouth of the Waccamaw and the Sandpit, to the location today of the capital, of the port city of Georgetown. 1729, it moved from up on the Black River down to the present day site. And a port city developed with docks and wharves, with timber and processing plants for pitch and tar, timber, pitch, and tar, what we call naval stores. Stores, like a storeroom, stores, supplies for the Navy. And whose Navy are we talking about? As an English colony, definitely British colony, Great Britain, who believed it had the greatest navy in the world. So as we exported naval stores, we also, according to port records, were exporting pork and beef. Pigs and cows were often turned loose in that early colonial period to eat under the longleaf pines, and then were herded as needed by male enslaved laborers who were called cowboys. The origin of the term cowboy began in South Carolina with those men who were enslaved but were knowledgeable on horseback, were knowledgeable in herding not only cows but also horses and almost all livestock. the origin of the national term cowboy. And then there are the wooded properties along the rivers of our Georgetown district. The Georgetown district that was divided up into Prince George Parish, Prince Frederick Parish, and then All Saints Parish, which at one time ran from Winyah Bay all the way up to the North Carolina-South Carolina line. All had riverfront access, every division of property, primarily at this early colonial period for transportation. Real estate maps show river frontage, show the wetlands, show the middle woods or high ground, but also show swamps which were full of cypress and tupelo and cedar trees, all valuable and all destined for British shipbuilding ports. Then the open woods were cleared, and those open fields begged for agriculture. The first real wealth in the colony, both Charleston, Georgetown, King Street, was from a new crop called indigo. And while Eliza Lucas wasn't the first to plant indigo, as we often say, she was the first to make indigo a viable crop. And within a short period of time, there'll be yet another indigo workshop, earlier at Waccamaw Neck Branch Library, and this summer at Andrews Branch Library. Take an opportunity to learn the history, the chemistry, and the dyeing process of that plant that produced indigo when steeped. We also know that during the time that indigo was being grown, there also were experiments along every riverfront plantation of this area with rice, cultivating rice in hopes that it would be more than just a domestic crop, more than just enough to feed a family or a large number of slaves on a particular plantation, but that rice might be enough for trade. And you know its history. Before and after the Revolutionary War, before the Civil War, and even after the Civil War ended in 1865, rice was grown. First in upland fields, like wheat and corn and oats, and then in inland swamps, except those swamps were dry when they needed to be wet when they needed to be dry. But then finally realizing the West African methods of tidal cultivation, rice planters and enslaved laborers began to successfully and exponentially produce rice along the Waccamaw, the PD, the Black, the Sandpit, and the Santee rivers. Millions of pounds of rice. Georgetown County grew more rice than any other place in the world except the area around Calcutta, India. And as I often like to remind you, because you may be traveling to Charleston, you might take a tour in the Charleston area one day, and you will hear those docents say, Charleston exported more rice than any other place in the world except Calcutta, India. And before you say, Lee said, remember, what's the nuanced difference that I said and that a docent in Charleston might say to you? Georgetown grew more rice than any other place in the world except the area around Calcutta. Charleston exported more rice than Calcutta, or second only to Calcutta. And by that we mean that by the time Georgetown rice planters had bought out the small rice planters, the wealthy got wealthier and wealthier. Profits were reinvested into more land and more humans in bondage to work those rice fields. Plantations developed their own steam-powered rice mills. They built, through slave labor, their own schooners, what I call the semi-truck of yesteryear, and those schooners traveled directly to the port of Charleston, alleviating a stop, which is time, as well as a second port tax. If rice planters owned a second home, it was no longer in Georgetown. It was where? In Charleston. Charleston may not have been the political center of the state, the political capital of the state after the Revolutionary War, but it was still the wealthiest capital and certainly the social capital of South Carolina. Profits, again, reinvested into more land and more enslaved laborers, and until 1808, slaves were imported directly from places in West Africa like Senegal, Gambia, Sierra Leone. In single-family cabins, slaves lived on plantations, particularly after 1808. Why? To encourage the family unit. Husband, wife, children, more grandchildren. Numbers increasing domestically since there were no more West Africans being brought by ship through the port of Charleston and other cities. These tidal rivers were the secret to the success of rice growing, but required labor-intensive attentions. One average small tract required 100 enslaved laborers. Imagine the land owned by a few large rice planters. For instance, Joshua John Ward, who lived and was headquartered at Brook Green, but he owned other plantations on the Waccamaw and the PD and owned 1,100 human beings altogether. Remember, Michelle Robinson Obama's ancestors were rice slaves at Silver Hill and Friendfield plantations on the Sandpit River, closest to Georgetown. Friendfield plantation on the Sandpit is different from the Friendfield plantation on the Waccamaw, where existing slave cabins are within Hobcall. Prior to Obama's, or during his campaign and prior to his election, a lot of media were calling the libraries. A lot of the media, whether they were from Japan, Great Britain, United States, were calling Hobcall because some of them had Googled Michelle Obama when they heard a rumor that she was from Georgetown County. And when they found the word Friendfield Plantation, they called us at Hobcall Barony and wanted to come and film and ask questions. And it was all I could do not to say, sure, that'd be great. And we did have early 20th century photographs of the cabins still lived in by slave descendants, their children and their grandchildren. However, Friendfield on the Waccamaw, a part of Hobcall, is not where Michelle Robinson's ancestors lived. Instead, her grandparents and further back lived on the Sandpit River at a plantation with a duplicate name. Rivers did all they were supposed to do. They flooded, they drained the fields with fresh water. From April to October, rice was planted, was tended, flooded, and drained, and then harvested just about the time of hurricane season. We did continue to plant rice even after the war, as I mentioned, but post-war production was in an ever-declining market. Rice conglomerates or consortiums or groups were formed to alleviate bankruptcy or any financial strain on just one person. A group of men went in together, pooled their resources. But remember too that in an ever-declining market, it meant that there were three major problems as well as any number of smaller problems. Initially, the unavailability of free labor destroyed what was a perfect system before, perfect according to slave-owning rice planters. So the unavailability of free labor, competition from western states like Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, where they were using steam-powered tractors and steam-powered upland irrigation on their fields to grow rice. And as they produced a great number of pounds of rice on the market, even if Georgetown County had a good year of rice production, say in 1890, it was still difficult because then there was so much rice on the market, the price had dropped and was not worth all that work. And then a series of weather events at the turn of the 20th century along these five rivers. Not just a hurricane, not just hurricanes almost year after year, but intermingled with severe droughts and intermingled with floods, or as they call them, freshets. And we know exactly what a freshet is now because many of us here today have lived through Hurricane Joaquin in 2015 that was like a fire hose being turned on the state of South Carolina from the tropical regions. Water that inundated us with inches and inches and feet of rain. And then when we recovered from that and flood in 2015, we had another even worse flood in 2018 by the name of Hurricane Florence. Florence washing out bridges in the backcountry along the Black River, the Sandpit River, the Waccamaw, the PD, the Santee, and also ruining acres and acres of current timberland, acres and acres of home sites, as well as paved roads. Freshets, floods, droughts, and hurricanes. 1910 was the last year a successful commercial crop of rice was milled, harvested, milled, and sold. 1910. But by 1910, something else had happened in Georgetown County. Lumber mills and new ownership of land along the rivers saved the economy of the 10s and 20s. Mr. Baruch, Bernard Baruch, was the first northerner to buy property in Georgetown County in 1905. Isaac Emerson from Baltimore, Maryland in 1906, a millionaire who purchased what would become Arcadia Plantation. And later, by 1930, the Huntingtons, who purchased on the Waccamaw River, from the river to the sea. And all along the PD, northerners like New Jersey resident Jesse Metcalf bought more acres than any other northerner. Jesse Metcalf, who was headquartered at Hasty Point Plantation on the PD River. Mr. Samworth, Thomas Samworth, who bought Exchange Plantation, but by 1945 bought Duralton Plantation on the PD River, and later gave it to the state of South Carolina. And on the Black River, Walker P. Inman, half-brother of Doris Duke, and also a well-known pilot, bought Greenfield Plantation on the Black River, just like the Chestons of Philadelphia bought that Friendfield on the Sandpit. The DuPonts bought properties on the Santee, and by 1931, scarcely a plantation was still in the hands of a South Carolinian. But I often call this purchase by northerners, a blessing in disguise, because much of that land on our 5 rivers is now protected in perpetuity. Brookgreen, Huntington Beach State Park, Arcadia with its conservation easements east of the highway, conservation easements at Arcadia west of the highway. Hobcaw Barony, 16,000 acres, privately owned but protected. Tom Yawkey Wildlife Center, owned by the state of South Carolina today, a gift from Tom Yawkey, 24,000 acres. Santee Coastal Reserve, state-owned, 24,000 acres. And then just below our county line, Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge, over 100,000 acres. Capers Island, a state-owned island, making up 66 miles of protected shoreline, roughly from Georgetown to Charleston. Protected shoreline that was all at one time connected to northern ownership. But in addition to northerners duck hunting on these waters, northerners boating, relaxing, feeling their blood pressure lower from their jobs in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, we also know that industry needs these woods and these waters and access to the ocean for shipping. And when the Atlantic Coast Lumber Company went bankrupt during the Great Depression, International Paper bought their land and bought more on the Sandpit River. In 1936, International Paper began construction of what would become, by World War II, the world's largest paper mill, right here in Georgetown. There was money to be made, especially from the cardboard boxes that were the signature product from International Paper. It was those waxed cardboard boxes that shipped rations to our soldiers throughout World War II. IP lands purchased in the county for for harvesting timber, tree farms, trucks, truckers, managers, the woodland division of IP, much less the work at the mill, at the port, at the plant itself. By the 1980s, the largest percentage of trees purchased by International Paper didn't come from their own land. Instead, it came from individual private tree farmers, pine plantation owners, tree farmers, and that percentage accelerated after the 1980s, the 90s, the 2000s. IP and other companies like Georgia Pacific and Midwest-Vaco have slowly been divesting themselves of these woodlands and instead buying from private property owners. In 1969, many of you know that the steel mill was constructed beginning at that time. Germans made a fine promise of a beautiful facility that could be located on the banks of the Sandra River next door to the industry we call the paper mill. And yet today that site is also prime real estate. 600 jobs were let go when the steel mill closed the first time several years ago. Families often had to move to follow jobs, or the breadwinner might find a job in North Charleston but not be able to commute on a daily basis because of a vehicle. Maybe they commuted once a week, and perhaps even less. And sometimes when we look at industry and jobs, not only think of the money that you have, or the money that you don't have, but when you lose a job and have to commute, imagine what that does to the family unit. When the head of the household might be gone an entire week or entire month at a time. The steel mill on Front Street is a cause of great concern now. Will it stay empty, or will it reopen? Will it ever be what it was beginning in 1969? And so think of the year 2000. I read an interesting journal article that said by the year 2000, 65% of the American population will want to live on or near water. And what would you say in the year 2022? Have we come pretty close to that 65% seeming like it lives on or near water? I think that's true. And because I live on the Waccamaw Neck, I especially think it's true. New homes, new gated communities are spreading up all the rivers of Georgetown County. And often, despite hurricanes, floods, and freshets, people migrate to water. Thus, real estate agents are eager to break up properties and sell them. As inland towns like Andrews struggle, the property values along waterways increase despite the threat of flooding. Newer houses with higher foundations are built. Transportation is improved to flee when need be. And that trickle-down effect we hope to see via property taxes. But for those of us who cannot afford to live on the water, or choose not to accept the risk, we are blessed because private, county, state, and federal landowners share the rivers with us. Programs, tours, public parks, boat ramps, guided canoe trips, guided kayaking trips, guided pontoon trips, all provide access to these rivers whether you own land on the river or do not, whether you own a boat or you do not. Take advantage of the views you might reach by simply driving to a public boat landing. As simple as sitting in your car at East Bay Park and looking out at the river itself. Think about parking at Hagley Landing and watching the sunset, much as they do in Key West every day at sunset. There's a large group that gathers at the Georgetown County Public Boat Landing called Hagley. Maybe you'll gather or put in your kayak one day at Potato Bed Ferry, not too far from Andrews on the County Line Road, not too far from the community of Warsaw. I love to mention Warsaw not only because of Maury's barbecue that I enjoy, but also because Warsaw seemed like an odd community name in a county like Georgetown. Warsaw, like Poland. But then I realized on the Robert Mills map that Warsaw, Mr. War, operated a mill, a sawmill at that vicinity, now located near the tracks as you make your way from Andrews to King Street, the back way. The community of Warsaw got its name from Mr. War's sawmill. When we have an opportunity to take a trip, you often wonder, how do I sign up? You might take a kayaking trip with Surf the Earth later on this summer. I'm going to start partnering with Surf the Earth, and we'll do kayaking trips over to historic Sandy Island, have a tour, and eat a big midday meal with native Sandy Islander Laura Harriet. In the meantime, I continue to partner with Captain Paul Kenny on Imagine Tours, his beautiful pontoon boat carrying a maximum of 6 paying guests. In the past has gone by boat to Arcadia Plantation on the Waccamaw River, to Sandy Island, and all summer long we'll travel to the Waccamaw and the Pee Rivers, talking not only about plantations, but also about ecology, Native Americans, African Americans. There are many special events and programs at Brook Green, at Hobcaw, Black River Cypress Preserve, at Yawkey, the Santee Coastal Reserve. All offer kinds of trips that you need to see. You need to learn more from professionals who study, research, and share what they also might learn from you. That was always my goal when I came to Georgetown County. I wanted to learn more from others. I came to work at Hobcaw Barony in 1984, and as I first left my hometown of Columbia, I reconnected with my Gordon clan on the Santee River near Lane and Godine, not too far from here. I was in touch with my Brockington cousins, and we retold stories of our British ancestors, British, not patriot, British ancestors at Willtown on Black Mingo Creek on the Black River. And especially as I learned more and more of our Georgetown County history, I found myself saying, I never knew that. And it's always been my hope as I lecture and as I hope to impart what I've learned, that I can make you say, I never knew that. That's interesting. Because it is helping you make these connections, understanding these connections, that gives us all a better understanding of where we've been, our national history, our Native American history, our early colonists, our enslaved laborers, the struggles to hold on to the land after the American Civil War, as well as duck hunting industry, and today tourism, and the county's largest employer, the hospital system. No longer IP, no longer the school district, but because of a great number of retirees, the hospital system is our largest employer. So whether it's you on the river, on a pontoon boat, or greeting out-of-towners in Georgetown's Harbor Walk, as you say perhaps, I was born here, I'm from here, just be sure and add the word welcome in your greeting. I was an outsider. I was a newcomer to Georgetown County, but I felt a welcome, especially from right here in Andrews. Eleanor Moody, founder of the museum in Andrews, knew that I was interested in Andrews history, its Black River, its trains, even the community called Little Italy. Little Italy. And I'm going to challenge each one of you that live or work in Andrews to let me know what you think is the origin of the Little Italy neighborhood, so often dominated by African American community here in Andrews, not too far from Food Lion. Also, I want you to know that in addition to Eleanor Moody making me feel welcome, the Osborns welcomed me into their Gamecock Cafe on Main Street, and wonderful Miss Kay Timms invited me every year to speak to her first grade classes at Andrews Primary before their field trip to Hobcaw. It was these people that helped me know and love Andrews, a part of Georgetown County that I didn't know as well until I knew them. Every community has a rich story. Every river in Georgetown County is different. We have much to celebrate as we move forward, learning as much as we can and continuing to share with one another. I thank the Georgetown County Library System for this opportunity to be here, and especially I thank Dan Turner for putting together this DigiBridge series with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, South Carolina Humanities, and also again our Georgetown Library System. Thank you very much.
And would you take a question or two if we have some?
I'll be glad to take a question if there is one. Yes.
I never knew Warsaw was war because of a sawmill.
And that is what I believe to be true at this point as we study the maps and take a look at other families whose last names are War, W-A-R-R. I became very interested in that part of Potato Bed Ferry and Mount Pleasant Plantation because a fairly new owner had purchased Mount Pleasant, as it's called, once connected to Tom Yawkey's attorney, and Mr. Defoe. And as the new owners, a group of hunters, were interested in studying its history and getting somebody to do a really good chain of title, really good work on maps, I realized that's not me. So I recommended someone else to do the work, Suzanne Linder Hurley, and then I was glad to interpret what they found. And Suzanne Linder Hurley also gave me a copy of the book she gave to the property owners in that area, because for the first time I discovered where my ancestors, the Brockingtons, had first settled on the Black River. And it was on that bluff that later came to be known as Mount Pleasant Plantation, not far from Potato Bed Ferry, not far from Mr. War's sawmill. So think about that next time you go to Maury's to eat barbecue. Huh?
Chief Hatcher, by the way, is a big fan of Maury's. He was mentioned
good.
that.
I'm
Yes,
glad to know that.
he loves that.
And
so.
I know he was one of the participants. He's
Yep.
been a speaker for our library many times,
Yes.
but especially recently.
Yes.
And he really stopped me cold.
Yep.
But what a great direct phone call to make if you've got a disagreement or simply if you need to set somebody straight. And we didn't discuss the word decimate, Chief Buster Hatcher and I, that first day, but he invited me by telephone to come up and visit the tribal grounds, to walk, to visit some of the cemeteries and learn more. And what a difference that one-on-one time with Chief Buster Hatcher meant. And it also meant that then I knew him well enough to invite him back in the 1990s to other programs, 2000s at Hobcall. And what a great way for all of us to learn from members of the Waccamaw tribe.
Yeah.
Thank y'all for having me today. I appreciate this time.
Thank you so much, Lee Brockington. A wonderful, just a centuries deep examination of the rivers of Georgetown County and so much history that surrounds the rivers. And we really appreciate it. And this will be available again on the Georgetown County Library YouTube channel for viewing and reviewing. So thanks again to Lee Brockington. Thank you for sharing your talents and expertise with us for DigiBridge 2.0.